Welcome to our November program for the Exeter Historical Society. I'm Ann Sheaver, chairman of the trustees, and I'm very, very happy that you're here this evening. What a fantastic turnout. And I'd like to thank all of you that were able to sign up for our Thursday Tipsy Trivia. It's our second event. Barbara is our star. And I apologize, we have no tickets left, but sign up now for the next one. So thank you for those of you that are here to support it. And I'd also like to thank the other trustees that are here this evening for the wonderful desserts, the wine and beer, coffee, everything. Vicki Guys, Lori Swan, John Ring, Jim Mills, Stacy Penna, Pam Jedham, Caroline Seeke, Ed Rowan, and a very dedicated, wonderful trustee and volunteer for years, Judy Rowan. And we'd also like to also Jackie Jenner, our hostess and and now, without further ado, I'd like to recognize and introduce our curator, Barbara Rimkunis, and she will introduce the speaker. Barbara.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm filling in for Laura Martin, our program manager, who is not here tonight. Our next program coming up is going to be in December, and that is our holiday open house. Yay. It's December. December what? What? Where's that trivia question?
It's
the first Tuesday, the 3rd of December. Okay, so come on over for some great snacks and holiday cheer, and we'll be glad to see you. Tonight's program is being sponsored by two different organizations. We would like to thank Eric Chinberg of Chinberg and the Mill Apartments, who sponsored it because of their attachment to our Exeter Mill, and of course also the New Hampshire Humanities Council, who are presenting this tonight and who are funding it. So they have a very set speech that you have to read when they are sponsoring it. So here it is. Welcome. I am Barbara Rimkunis, your name, role, and organization, the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. We're grateful to the New Hampshire Humanities for supporting this program and want to thank you for attending. New Hampshire Humanities is an independent nonprofit. Its work is statewide, but it's not a state agency. New Hampshire Humanities grants and programs support local organizations like this one. Each year, New Hampshire Humanities has sponsored more than 650 educational and cultural programs each year all over the state. Who's been to one this year? Yeah, we all have probably. And here you are now. So please be sure to write your comments on the evaluation forms provided. You should have had one on your seat. If you need a pen, we have pens. Please be sure to include your name and address so that they can put you on their mailing list. I'd be happy to connect you to the New Hampshire Humanities staff if you have any questions, suggestions, or ideas. I won't. I'll actually tell you to go to their website, which just Google New Hampshire Humanities. Thank you for coming. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. His name is Robert Perreault. Robert Perreault has worked as a research assistant, oral history interviewer, librarian, archivist, freelance writer, historical tour guide, public speaker, photographer, and conversational French teacher to promote Manchester's history and New England's Franco-American culture since 1973. Wow. He missed going to Woodstock by 2 weeks. But he actually attended the Atlantic City Pop Festival 2 weeks before that, and it was almost the same performers, and he kept a list. This is the kind of person who speaks now. Let's see, he has written his works of nonfiction and fiction written in French, in English, or in both languages include 7 books and more than 160 articles, essays, and short stories published in the US, Canada, and France. Perreault holds an MA in French with specializations in New England Franco-American Studies from Rhode Island College and an MFA in Creative Writing Fiction from Southern New Hampshire University. In June of 2012, Manchester's Center Franco-American named him Franco-American of the Year. Doesn't get much better than that. Without further ado, here is Robert Perreault.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I am overwhelmed by this crowd. I'm just even in Manchester, we don't get crowds like this. I don't know. You guys do really good PR or this or
It's the
whatever.
wine.
Okay, and I haven't had any, so I want to stay completely sober for the whole evening. I gotta say, when I was a little kid, and before the Highway 101 took us to the beach, we used to go through Exeter, and I can remember, we don't have a gazebo like that in Manchester, so as a little kid, I was thrilled to go through there and see that gazebo. I wanted my parents to stop and let me get out so I could climb up in there and look around and whatever. But that's my memory of Exeter. So I'm thrilled to be here because it's the first time I've spoken here. I've spoken in many different cities and towns in New Hampshire, but this is my first time here. And I wanted to point someone out I don't want to embarrass him, but you mentioned that I have a master's from SNHU. And my first teacher, Bob DeGiebing, sitting right over there in the chair, helped me learn how to become, I hope, a good writer of fiction. But tonight we're doing nonfiction. And I don't want to keep you too long, so we'll get to it. This is Amoskeag Falls in Manchester. If it weren't for Amoskeag Falls, there would not be a Manchester. For 11,000 years, Native Americans came here to trade, but especially to fish. Amoskeag means place of many fish. So fast forward to the 18th century, and this is when Europeans began to settle in the area which they called Dairyfield. So the falls got them there, and they settled there, and it was a small Yankee town through the 18th century. And one of the citizens there was named Samuel Blodgett. Samuel Blodgett was a lawyer. He became a judge. He was a farmer. He was an inventor. He was what I would call kind of like a jack of all trades, like the Benjamin Franklin of Dairyfield, if you wanted. And he was one of those industrialists who went over to England during the Industrial Revolution. He went to Manchester, England, and he studied the textile industry over there. Now, in those days, of course, England wanted to protect their industry. They didn't want people to, set up something to compete with them. So he had to memorize everything. When he got on the boat back to back to America, this is late 1700s, early 1800s. He had to write down, the minute he got on the ship and passed customs, write down all the diagrams that he had in his head, all the notes that he had in his head, so that when he could come back, they created the first mill in Dairyfield, 1805. Something like Samuel Slater did down in Rhode Island and other industrialists like that. Well, they also had a canal built. He had a canal built around Amoskeag Falls. And he died right when the canal was built. That is, took from 1793 to 1809 to get that canal built. And when it was built, they opened it up, and he rode down the canal in May, and he died in September. A couple years later, they renamed Dairyfield Manchester in honor of his prediction, because his prediction was, here at Amoskeag Falls, by my canal, will be one day the Manchester of America. And so because he said that, the Manchester of America, they renamed the town Manchester. The first few mills in Manchester were small spinning mills like this, spinning and weaving. But eventually, 1831, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company was incorporated. Now, we call it the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company because they were manufacturing, but they were more than that, they were a land and water power development company. That is, they bought land on both sides of the Merrimack River for 1 mile so that they could develop that land and make it into a city. Now, the map that you see here is a map that shows what Derryfield looked like, except that now it's Manchester. You see the river there, and you see some diagonal roads that lead all the way down to the river. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company imposed their map on top of that, and you can see that they have streets, much more modern looking. This is 1835, so just 4 years after they were incorporated. So they actually, Amoskeag created Manchester. And the Amoskeag, by the way, this company came out of Boston. You've heard probably of the Boston Associates, who were industrialists and financiers in Boston, who created the city of Waltham. They created the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, and then Manchester and other places like Lawrence and Dover and other mill towns. So this was going on all over New England. But Manchester became the largest. At first, you can see that the mills already, you're seeing buildings that were much bigger and made of brick rather than the small mill that you saw earlier. So this company is growing awfully fast. This is a view of Manchester in 1855. It's a print, and if you look, you can see it's all woods and fields in front of you, but then all along the river, that whole line along the river, you see mills growing awfully fast. And here's from early years of photography to show you just how the mill yard was growing. And you see the Claristory mill there, the peaked roof. We don't have those anymore in Manchester. In some other places you see those with peaked roofs. The Claristory, they said, was a fire trap, and so they decided, no, this is not good. So they got rid of those, and they've all got flat roofs. How many people have actually been to Manchester and seen the mills? Oh, a lot of you. Is there anybody from Manchester here? Originally, yeah. They also built corporation housing for their workers. And you're probably wondering, well, who were those workers? Well, in the very early days, they were mainly local people, farmers who decided to give up farming and become mill workers. And then you've probably heard of the mill girls. They're more famous down in Lowell, but we had the mill girls as well in Manchester. These were young ladies who came from the farming communities. It was almost like sending your daughter off to college. You know, she would go and live in a boarding house in Manchester, work in the mills, and earn money for her dowry, or maybe for her education, or sometimes for her brother's education. They weren't too happy about that. Or to help out on the farm. And they'd be there for maybe a year or 2 or 3. That was mostly it. And because you were sending your daughter off to the big city, because that's what it was like, the Amoskeag wanted to make sure that everything was okay for these young ladies. So number one, the young ladies themselves had to have a note from their pastor to say that they were good, church-going, moral young ladies. And then in order to assure the parents that the young ladies would be well taken care of, there were rules. For the boarding houses, for example, they weren't allowed to have men in the rooms. They weren't allowed, the girls themselves were not allowed to smoke. They weren't allowed to drink. They were also, there was a curfew. They had to be in by a certain time. So their lives were really well regulated. So this is all happening in the 1840s. I said Amoskeag was incorporated in 1831, so this is the 1840s and the 1850s for the most part. These are the people working in the mills, those mill girls and local people. But the mills kept growing and growing. Now you see here they've got bales of cotton. Amoskeag was mainly a cotton textile manufacturing company, and they did have wool as well. So, and they also produced steam fire engines in their machine shop. They produced locomotives. If you want to see a locomotive, go up to Vermont, White River Junction, Vermont. There's one right in the center of town. I was told that you people have an Amoskeag steamer here in your museum. I didn't know that. I just learned something, so I want to come back and see that. This is an Amoskeag steamer, which is now in the Mill Yard Museum in Manchester. So if you come to the Mill Yard Museum, you can see this. But here it's on parade. They also manufactured, during the Civil War, they manufactured rifles for the Union Army. And they made sewing machines for the Singer Company. So, but mainly it was textiles. And you can see, I say the mills were growing. I mean, you see this kind of, this photograph. I mean, you can't even see to the other end. That's how huge some of these mills were. This is a weave room. Anybody ever been in a weave room? Yeah? Isn't it something? I mean, the first time I visited a weave room, first time I visited a mill, I was outside, and somebody said, put your hand against the brick and feel the building shake. That's how much it was, how those machines, those looms, going click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, hundreds of them all at once, and you'd go deaf. And I mean, OSHA forced us to wear earplugs, but there was no OSHA for these people back then, and so a lot of the people were going deaf when they were young. I mean, we complain today about rock stars and rock music, but in those days they had this kind of machinery, and it was just amazing. So now, before I get to this next series, I want to say that the mills were growing to a point where the people that I mentioned before who would work there, there just weren't enough people to fill the mills. And so they began to import people. And so they were importing some people from Great Britain who were experts, expert spinners, expert weavers. The Scots were known as expert dyers, and they were bringing in some also from Sweden and from Germany. Those were the experts, but something happened over in Ireland in the 1840s, and that was the potato famine. And so thousands and thousands and thousands of Irish people, Irish Catholics, began coming to places like Manchester and working in the mills. And these were the first unskilled workers. So they were not necessarily welcome when they came because they were unskilled. They had to be trained, and because they were Catholic and the mills were, the mill owners and mill workers of before were largely Protestant, that didn't work out too well, but they needed workers, and so they had to accept them. And the next people to come in were the French Canadians. Now, I happen to have a series of photographs that show French Canada, so I don't have Ireland, I don't have all these other countries, but I just wanted to show the contrast, that because most of the people who would come to the mills later on would be all these unskilled workers from different places, mostly in Europe. But because I have this series from French Canada, I want to show you just how different life was for these people. And even though it's French Canada, you can say, well, it would be close to the same thing. Farming is farming, and that's where most of these people were coming from. Farming villages in Ireland, in Canada, in Greece, in Poland, in Russia, and other places. And so most of them came from little villages like this. You can see that it's quiet, it's peaceful. Everyone owns their farm. They own the land. And agriculture is a family affair. Even the kids even get involved in agriculture. And so they're living off the land. This is subsistence farming, by the way. This is not commercial farming. They're growing crops and they have animals and whatnot to help the family survive. This is what it's all about. And there's always got to be someone who's going to make some money. So in this case, you have a father who is a blacksmith. So he's bringing in a little bit of money, but he's also a farmer. But not a lot of money. So what happens? They need work, and so they end up migrating. Now the difference between the French Canadians and the Europeans is the ocean, obviously. The French Canadians can go back home, back and forth, and so they're keeping their language and their culture much longer than those who are from Europe and are separated. The ones who are, if you're coming from Italy or Germany or Sweden or Russia or Hungary or wherever, you're never going to see your relatives again. You're never going to see your farm again because it costs a lot of money to come over and to go back. And so most of these people were saying goodbye for the last time. So you can imagine what a terrific culture shock that must have been for these people. Whereas the Canadians, they could go back and forth. I say that the railroad was like the umbilical cord to the mother country, but it was never cut. So, and here's a lady, a Canadian lady. We'll talk about her to really make the contrast. Now she works at home. It's quiet. She makes her own work hours. She's working with wool from her sheep. They own the sheep. Or maybe she's spinning flax, which they grow on their land. She's in control of her life. You know, if she wants to take a break, she can take a break when she wants. She's breathing clean air. I said it was quiet. But they're not bringing in a lot of money. Maybe she's got that blacksmith husband of hers, but they're not bringing in a lot of money, and so that's why they're going down to places like Manchester and Lowell and other places like that. Oh, and another thing too, in small villages like that, everybody speaks the same language. Everybody is pretty much of the same religion. In this case, it's French, and they're Catholics. And they practice the same customs, the same traditions. And then they come down for a better life in places like Manchester. They come on the train, and they get there, and what do they see? What a contrast to that first picture you saw, that little village with all the little wooden houses and whatnot. This is Manchester, the big city. Now, I grew up in Manchester. I thought of it as a small city. New York was a big city. But to these people, this would be a big city. With Elm Street, the main street, you know, it's a lot bigger than that street. That, by the way, that village that you saw, that was the main street cutting through the village. So, and the people. Imagine the people. This is in the mill yard. Now, if I could hear those people speaking, what would I hear? I would hear English, of course, but I would hear French. I would hear Polish, German, Swedish. Well, I'll tell you, In 1916, fast forward here, in 1916, a journalist spent a week in the mills just going around observing and interviewing people. And when he wrote about them, he claimed that he heard 28 different languages spoken in these mills. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, anybody that knows the Manchester School Department today, if you go on their website, they will tell you that in the schools of Manchester, there are 70, that's 70 plus languages spoken by the kids in the schools of Manchester today. So these people are all coming from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, different languages. And somehow they have to come together and make cloth for the ambuscade. And it wasn't always harmonious. Every time there was a new group coming in, of course, when you're the new kid on the block, you're going to get, made fun of, and you're going to be discriminated against and whatnot. But somehow you have to get over it, fit in, and make cloth for the ambuscade. Now the ambuscade, they were smart in a certain way. They tended to put people in groups. So you would have a section of a weave room where everybody on those looms, everybody spoke this language, and everybody in that corner spoke that language and whatnot. And they would name, like, at least for the Irish, who were the first unskilled people, and the French after, the French Canadians, those people, because they had been here the longest, sometimes if they were skilled enough, they would name them what they called a second hand. A second hand was like a small boss. He's in between the big boss and the people. And that person, the second hand, usually was bilingual. So he, and I say he because it was the women, there were what they called the room girls. Room girls could also kind of boss the women around, but the men, it was just men for second hand. The second hand was bilingual so that he could get instructions from the big boss. Let's say that, oh, your people are working too slowly or something. Okay, guys, you're going to have to work a little bit faster. The boss isn't too happy or whatever. But they enjoyed it because they felt one of their people had been promoted, which is good, because maybe someday, maybe I'll be promoted too if I do a good job and whatnot. And it was a way for the company to control the people. It was a way to, make them feel wanted, but at the same time, it was like, I call it a benign control, if you want. So, now, the lady that was at the spinning wheel, I said, we'll talk about her. Well, this is not the same lady, by the way, but let's pretend it's the same lady. So she's left her farm, and she's come to work in the ambuscade mills. How has her life changed? Well, first of all, you see her, she's between looms. She's not at home. She's in the mill. And she goes to that mill when they say she goes to the mill. So it's, the bell rings in the morning, and she has to be in by 6, because they're working 6 in the morning till 6 at night. So that's 12 hours. They get a little break for lunch, but that's not much. And in the early days, they were working those 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. 72 hours. Now, when things started to improve, they gave them Saturday afternoons off, and then Saturdays. And eventually it went from 72 all the way down to 48 hours. But that took several decades for that to happen. Okay, so the 72 hours, that would be in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, in those years. And eventually, by World War I, they were working 48 hours. Now, I said she's working in the mill. Well, how different is it from working at home? She has to work when they say she works. If she wants to take a break, she's tired, she can't. She's breathing cotton dust constantly, which gives you lung problems. She's hearing those looms, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, all the time, and it's making her go deaf. She's working with material that is not hers. Remember I said they grew flax on their land and they had sheep? This is material, cotton or wool, that belongs to the company. The machinery belongs to the company, not like her spinning wheel back home. And what is she doing? She's making raw cloth. At home, she was making clothing for her family. She was making every operation of the, to make the clothing, from the shearing the sheep all the way to wearing the clothing. So she had a certain identification with her work. She could be proud. I made that sweater for myself, or I made that jacket for my husband, or I made those socks for my grandchildren, or whatever. She can't do that here because she's making raw cloth. Because that's all the Ambuscade made, was raw cloth. The cloth would be then shipped off to other factories to make into clothing. So at the end of the day, she doesn't have anything to show for her day. But at the end of the week, she's got something else. She's got money. And money is what kept her going. And that's why a lot of them stayed put. I said that farming was a family affair. The children got involved in farming. Well, the children got involved in the mills as well. I know this is shocking to see that by today's standards. Kids working in the mills at age 8, age 9, age 10. They could do certain things that large fingers couldn't do, threading things and get their fingers in, and they'd get their fingers caught and they'd lose fingers and they'd lose limbs. And children sometimes can be naughty and fool around and run around and bump into things and whatnot. And so there were, eventually there were laws. In fact, this photograph was part of a huge series by Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine went around the country taking pictures of all kinds of children working in all kinds of jobs like this in order to try to enact child labor laws. Most of these pictures were taken in a sneaking way. They couldn't just go in, and I don't know exactly how he did it, because especially for the cameras of those days, they were heavy and they had glass negatives and whatnot, but somehow he managed to take pictures of kids working. And he took pictures of kids outside as well. I look at this, I always think of the Little Rascals when I see them. They kind of have that look. So, and these are kids, by the way, who would grow up most likely to work in the mills, because they are photographed by corporation housing. And these kids, those especially that lived in corporation housing, they were the ones who were from families, oftentimes, who were the skilled workers, those who spoke English. Very few of the immigrants, unless they were skilled, lived in corporation housing. I know that the Irish Catholics and the French Canadian Catholics, they were able to live in corporation housing only around World War I, and that was, and finally Ambuscade closed it in the 1930s. The Greeks, the Polish, the Russians, the Hungarians, those who came in later on, like in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, those people never lived in corporation housing. There was always a long waiting list. Some of these were nice townhouses. In fact, you can still see them now in Manchester. The townhouses, some of them had 2 floors with, you could have 3 rooms on the ground floor and 3 rooms upstairs. Some had 3 floors, so you'd have 9 rooms. And I did interviews with former workers of the Ambuscade Mills for a book called Ambuscade back in the 70s. It was my first job out of college. And I asked these
people, I said, what was it like to live there? They said it was wonderful because the Amoskeag took care of everything for you, and the rent was cheap. It was relative in those days, relatively cheap. It was $1 per room per month. So you could have a 9-room townhouse for $9 a month. And the pays in those days were dependent what the job was. I mean, some of the really skilled workers, like the machinists and people like that, the men could make up to $35 for a 2-week, because they were paid every other week. And by the way, they were paid in silver dollars, I was told. Gold coins at first, but silver dollars later on. So, but a worker, say like a woman weaver, might make like $10 in a 2-week period. So it depended what year and whatnot. But anyway, and of course, we talk about mill work as being drudgery, and it was. But people also manage to sometimes, when something is drudgery, you always try to find a way out. And so a lot of them, they goofed off when the boss wasn't looking. The boys would chase the girls around the spinning frames or whatever. And a lot of them, people I interviewed, said they met their spouse in the mills. And so I saw this photograph and I said, well, maybe they're a couple, maybe they'll get married, or that maybe they are, or whatever, but they look happy anyways. There were some happy days in the mills. So the typical immigrant family here on their porch, you can see that this is a 3-decker because there are 3 mailboxes and 3 doorbells there, and there are several generations. You can see there are grandparents there and ladies and then children. In these houses, oftentimes it was the goal of mill workers to own one of these houses, because if you could own one of these houses, then chances are you could have your entire family living there. On the first floor, you might have the grandparents or the parents, whatever, and on the upper floors, you'd have the married children living there. Or you could, if you didn't have such a large family, which most of them did have large families, though, they could live, paying rent, in order to help pay the mortgage and all that. And Amoskeag had a plan for that, because remember I said Amoskeag owned all that land. They bought all the land for 1 mile on both sides of the Merrimack River. So they built housing, like this is not corporation housing here. This is just regular housing that they build for the people who worked in the mills and could not live in corporation housing. So because they own the land, they build these houses for them, and they would sell them to their loyal workers and give them a really good deal on the mortgage and whatnot. So a lot of people who never would have become homeowners became homeowners through the Amoskeag. And some of the typical houses, this was some multi-family housing in an ethnic neighborhood. And that's the typical, I said, 2-decker or 3-decker house. This is the kind of house most people wanted to live in. Very few lived in single-family houses. And this was one of the poorest neighborhoods, actually. This was on the west side of Manchester. It was called the Flatiron District, and it was a largely French-speaking area. They had, on the ground floors, they had stores and boutiques, all kinds of, barber shop, tailor shop. The first credit union in the United States was founded there, St. Mary's Bank, founded by the French people. So, and there was an equivalent Greek neighborhood, and Irish neighborhood, and others as well. So, this is one typical person when I say typical, the story of what most mill workers wanted. This guy was named Moïse Verret, or Moses Verret. He came to Manchester at the age of 14 from French Canada, and he worked in the mills first, and he saved his money, and he was able to open his own barber shop. And then that didn't work out, so he opened his own grocery store. If you know Manchester, where the SNHU, what used to be called the Verizon Center, this is now it's the SNHU, his store was approximately there. And he was a grocer who supposedly, this is what his son told me, his son, by the way, was a priest, a Monsignor, and I served as his altar boy. So he told me, he shared this picture with me. He said, my father supposedly had the first refrigerated counters in New Hampshire, and people would come from miles around to see my father's refrigerated counters. And if you're asking, what are all those chickens doing up there? I can see that people are asking. The story is, because he had refrigerated counters, he could keep the chickens in there right up until the Amoskeag. Remember I said they worked 6 in the morning till 6 at night? Well, they would, like, the bell would ring and everybody would come flowing out. And by the way, Amoskeag at its peak had 17,000 workers. So imagine 17,000 workers all suddenly coming out, right? And he's just up the street from the mill yard, and it's Thursday. They've payday, and they've got silver dollars in their pockets jingling, and they come by. Well, he took those things out half an hour before they got out of the mill and hung them up. So they're not out there all day long. They're out there, and they just like that, you know, chicken in every pot, you know, one of those things. So that's the story he told me. So anyway, and so eventually, Moïse Verret was able to buy this house. I said not too many were able to afford single-family houses, but he bought this house, and there he is with white hair, sitting down. He's the first French mayor of Manchester, elected in the fall of 1917. So this is kind of the Horatio Alger story. This is what most people aspired to. This is what most people did not achieve, but it was what they were going after, the immigrants I'm talking about. In 1911, the Amoskeag reorganized. They were having problems because people, see, there were 30 mill buildings in the mill yard. And so and it was all the same company. You know, in the early years, it wasn't the same company. There were smaller companies, and Amoskeag kind of eventually, they built their buildings for them and eventually took them over. And a lot of times, the same officers were officers from Amoskeag to other companies. So a lot of it was kind of like, almost like a big industrial family. Well, what would happen, someone would go to a mill and apply for a job, and they'd start working, and they were not working out quite well. They're too slow, or they're goofing off all the time, or some of them are even stealing cloth or whatever, stealing tools and whatnot. And so they get fired. So what do they do? Go to the next mill over and get hired there. Now it's still the Amoskeag company, but it's a different mill. And now the bosses, they meet now and then and they talk, and it's like, well, I just had this guy today, oh, he was terrible, I had to fire him, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I just hired him. So Amoskeag decided to reorganize, and one of the things they did was they formed their own, they built their own employment office. So now you had to go in and apply at the office, and you had a file. Everyone who worked at Amoskeag had a file. So when you got hired, this is what you would get, an employment pass like this. And then when you left the position, you would get a discharge slip like this. Now there are people who have one employment pass and one discharge slip, and they might have worked there for 20 years. And others might have worked for a week, and that's it, and they got the same thing. And others, for whatever reason, they would keep rehiring them, and they got the files this thick. And how do I know that? Because if you go to the Manchester Historic Association's Research Center, they have 100,000 files like this. I said at their peak they had 17,000 workers. Well, I said they reorganized in 1911. They closed in 1936. So through all those years, 100,000 people passed through the Amesgate working like this. And I don't know if you noticed, some of you can read this. It says on this slip, this guy, it's the same guy by the way, it says he's illiterate. But I think the boss was somewhat illiterate too, because he worked too T.O. hard. Anyway, and some of those are funny. This was an easy one, work too hard. There are some, it says things like, he was caught smoking on the job, or stealing cloth, or fooling around with the girls, or whatever it was. There were all kinds of funny things like that. So. And by the way, the reorganization of Amesgate was also done to make the mills a better place to work, because they were competing with the South. Now in the South, in the early years, of course, there was slavery, and they didn't have textile mills like we have here. They didn't have the powerful rivers with the water power that we have here. But eventually, when steam was invented, the steam engine was invented, then they started building mills down south, and they freed the slaves. But a lot of the freed slaves, as well as white people, would work in the mills, but for much cheaper wages. And also the fact that cotton was grown down south. They didn't have to ship it up north and have it processed here and then shipped somewhere else. They could just ship it. I mean, it was right there growing, so they just would bring it into the mills. So the southern mills were able to sell their cloth for a lot cheaper than the northern mills. And so what was happening is the northern mills would lower the wages, and they would increase hours to try to compete, so that, and that caused strikes. So Amesgate became known as the Stripeless City because, Manchester that is, because Amesgate initiated programs like this. They gave land, for example, to families where they would give them seeds and tools, and they could grow vegetables. This was actually the children's vegetable garden, so they could grow vegetables, and either the family would consume them or they could sell them to make money or whatever. And they built a playground for the kids, and they had free dental and medical. So the Bernie Sanders of 100 years ago. And they had a program for a safety program. You can tell, I don't have to explain this, do I? I think it's quite, for those who can't see that well, the moral of the story is don't push your fellow worker down the stairs because it's not healthy. So and they've got others. They've got one where it shows a man and walking in the mill, and there's a bobbin on the floor, and then the next one you see him just kind of flipping up, like rolling on the bobbin. So they're kind of funny. This is probably the most famous photograph ever to come out of Manchester. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. This was 1914, at the beginning of World War I. Of course, the United States was not in the war until 1917, but still. They put this, the Amesgate company put this flag, they made this flag. All the people in that photograph, both downstairs and in the windows upstairs, made that flag. It was a 95 by 100 feet. And it was made for the city of Chicago. It was one of these flags that, you'd have, it was very heavy, so people would have to stand all around it, and it would be flat, and you could bring it down the street in a parade, so that people who were on upper floors would be able to see it like that. So, and actually just a couple summers ago, they made another one and put it up on the mill building. It's in color. You can see that online now. So I said that they were trying to ward off labor troubles, but eventually even Amoskeag could not avoid it. And so what happened is in 1922, in February, they announced that they were going to decrease wages by 20%. Yeah, and increase the work week. Remember I said they had gone down from 72 hours to 48. Now they were going to up the hours from 48 to 54 hours. Well, that didn't go over well. This is a picture of the first day of the strike in February of 1922. And that strike lasted for 9 months. Yeah, 9 months. And I remember 17,000 people out of about 70,000 workers, 17,000 workers out of a population of 70,000. Everybody either worked at Amoskeag or was related to somebody who worked at Amoskeag. It crippled the city for 9 months. So this is a march across the Bridge Street Bridge at the time. Another rally. There are all kinds of rallies, whatnot. I interviewed some people in 1974 for that book Amoskeag, where people from the same family, one was for the strike, the other one was against the strike, and they hadn't spoken to each other since 1922, and this was 1974. Over 50 years, just divided over the strike. It was a big deal. So, the strike eventually was settled, but then Amoskeag just went downhill after that. After 1922, people told me that it just wasn't the same thing. If a woman were if she were working on 6 looms, now they gave her 12 looms, but with no hike in pay or whatever. It just went down, 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 and they downsized as well, to the point where by 1935, in September of 35, there had been 2 more strikes in the 30s. They closed. And there were only 2,000 people left when they closed, from 17,000 in 22 to 2,000 in 1935. And then Christmas Eve, 1935, they declared bankruptcy. But the mill was already closed. They declared bankruptcy. Then in the early, January, February of 36, they tried to reorganize so they could reopen. But then the famous flood of 1936 came. Yes, wow. The entire first floor of the mills along the river was underwater. And so when the waters receded, there was sand and silt, and it was just horrible. And they gave up. That was it. So they sold the land and the buildings. The Public Service Company of New Hampshire bought part of it, half of it actually, $2.5 million. And the other $2.5 million, this, by the way, $5 million for this mill yard, it was like the Louisiana Purchase, very cheap. The other was filled by diversified companies. You had smaller textile companies that came in. You had shoe shops that came in. You even had a French pea soup company, Habitant Pea Soup came in, and other companies, the Cott Bottling Company, Silver Brothers, and others like that. So the mill yard was no longer controlled by one corporation, because when they went out of business, that crippled the city. So I will now show you just very quickly, and then we'll close, just a series of photographs that I myself shot in the 1970s. So those are in color, 70s and 80s, and the inside of a textile mill. Because this was the last mill that closed, the Wambeck. It closed in 1981. So,
What were they making?
they were making cloth as well. The last two mills actually were Wambeck, and before that was the Chicopee. Wambeck closed in 81, Chicopee closed in 75. Chicopee made gauze for Johnson & Johnson. So, and you can see some of these were deteriorating. They got broken windows, and there was Arms Textile was a company that they had wool, and they had anthrax, and that closed the mill. And there were deaths from anthrax. Now they had to close that, and that sat abandoned for several decades until finally they tore it all down. And now it's a park, Arms Park, right by the river. So, and some of the corporation housing deteriorated and whatnot. Some was torn down, but some was refurbished. Now, when I was a kid, living in the old corporation housing, it was considered you were poor. Now it's gentrified. You can't even afford it, And the canals, I could remember as a kid, you could tell what they were dying on a particular day by the water was purple, the water was green, the water was yellow, whatever. Well, they filled those canals, and they made the street, commercial street. This is a whole row of mills right here, gone, along the river, see? And now it's a park, a parking lot, really. So, and they've refurbished the mill yard completely. They could have torn everything down. They did tear about between a third and a half in the late 60s and 1970s. But now it's all nice and clean. UNH was, they're still down there, but they're in a different building than that now. And you can see the old and the new. There again, the old and the new. This is the Mill Girl statue. This was unveiled in 1988 to honor the young ladies, the mill girls who work there. So, the sculptress, she's from Elliott, Maine, Antoinette Schulze. She's the one in red. And she, by the way, the mill girl, she's like the Statue of Liberty. She turned green. So, just so you know. And I'll leave you with a sunset over Amoskeag. Actually, it's hard to see there, but that church, St. Marie's Church, it looks like it's sitting from that angle on top of a mill. And to me, that photograph symbolizes what Manchester is all about. It was work and faith. That's what it was. The people who worked there built the churches and everything else. So, and I'll leave you with that. And any questions I'll answer.
How many African Americans worked in the mills in Manchester?
As far as I know, none. They didn't have race on that application. But there were very few African Americans living in Manchester. I know of one lady in the 19th century, only because the Manchester Historic Association one day had this day, they used to have these days where it was like open house in certain historic houses, and people are living in these houses, by the way, and they would just open their house and let anyone visit. And there was this one house where they said that there had been an African-American lady living there in the 19th century. But, you know, really, I've never heard that there were any African-Americans living and working in the mills. So, yes.
What happened to all those nice New England farm girls when the immigrants all came and took the jobs?
The nice New England farm girls were never intended to work in those mills for a long time. It was when the mills, things were still okay, you know, like working in the mills was a good thing, and supposedly, you know, that's what they said. And they were only working there for a year, 2, 3, maybe. They wouldn't have stayed anyway. It had really nothing to do with the immigrants. You know, they were never intended to spend their whole life working there. So, yes.
Did any of the mills ever work with hemp?
That's a good question. And I don't have an answer, but I think possibly, quite possibly. I know they made denim.
Made what?
Denim for the Levi Strauss. Oh yeah, jeans. The denim was made for Levi Strauss company. But hemp, I've not heard about that, but quite possibly.
In my own research on Lowell,
Yeah.
in the first 20 years in Lowell, the mill girls who were at that time all off of the farms, New England,
Right.
young women, the unrest became strong enough for a lot of reasons. Lawrence was built, there was pressure on the mills, and they held the bread and roses strike, and
Yeah.
mill owners, instead of honoring their strike, knew ahead of time it was going to happen, and the first boats arrived the day after the strike, bringing European immigrants who had already signed contracts to work for lower wages, and the mill girls were trying to get higher wages. So one piece of the awful antipathy between them came out of that the farm girls were trying to make the mill owners pay them what they considered a decent wage, and instead they got lower wages or get out.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And I assume that the same tactics were employed in Manchester, and I wonder if you can tell us.
Oh, they had strike breakers definitely coming in, especially from Canada. And that's one of the things that, like I said, that family that, you know, were pro and anti-strike within the same family, stuff like that was happening there. They were bringing them in from Canada because, you know, a lot of them just felt they needed work, and they weren't necessarily conscious. For them, it was like, hey, I'm taking care of my family, and that's it. And, they reopened one mill, the Chicopee Mill, in June, and the police were there to try to, you know, keep the peace. And, you know, people were throwing rocks at the you know, the strike breakers and whatnot. So.
And when did the unions come in?
The unions really had, they had unions coming in, but they had trouble because of all the different languages that people spoke. Different languages, different religions, different work ethic. A lot of the Canadians, for example, you know, the Bishop of Manchester was Bishop Gertin at the time, Bishop Girton, who was telling his pastors to tell their flocks on Sunday to respect, respect work and go back to work and don't be strikers. And he even got involved in the negotiations.
And in Lowell, the owners were giving $10,000, $15,000
Yeah.
to the Bishop of Boston to have the priest tell the
Yeah.
workers to
There was
do what they were
a
told.
lot of that stuff going on. So, you know, yes.
We remember in the early 1980s, come up to Manchester, we were saw Pandora.
Right.
They made sweaters.
Pandora made sweaters. They were remember when I said some diversified industry came into the mill yard after 1936. Pandora came in 1940. So, yeah, they were making sweaters
When did they go out?
in the early 80s.
You know, I just had a question on the women's union. Was that, I'm trying to remember, was that the first women's union in the United States? At Anastate there?
No,
No.
no. And it wasn't a women's.
I thought there was a women's union in the Anastate also.
I've never heard that there was a women's union. I know women were the first ones to go back to work. That day, when I said there were strike breakers, a lot of them were women because they were told, well, nobody's going to throw rocks at women. Well, they did. But women were the ones who had the guts to go back. I mean, it took a lot of guts to go back.
And they had kids to feed.
Do they have records of like where over in Europe they went to recruit people to come over? Because I know my great-grandfather was recruited to come over here
Yeah.
from the shoe mills.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was similar and if they had key locations that they had gone to.
They did. They went to Europe and they went to French Canada especially because the French were known as industrious and docile.
They are.
That was the word. That's what they said. Industrious. Those were the words. Industrious and docile. In other words, they'll do whatever they're told, regardless.
I've noticed that too.
Yeah. Oh, I can remember. I went to French parochial school in the 1950s and 60s, and I can remember the nuns telling the kids, you know, if you don't like something, well, just bear it, offer it up to God, and someday, you know, you'll be in the front row up in heaven. And, you know, those people who complain, they're going to be out back. You know? So, there was another one? Yes.
I'm interested in the anthrax problem. Was that a problem in other mills too, working with wool, or was?
Can I answer this one? I'm a hand spinner. You can still contract anthrax from a particularly dirty fleece.
Yeah, and it's the spores. The spores can go. These were goat. This was goats in Arms Textile. But the spores can lie dormant for years, and you just disturb them. And
That's what
that's
Sleeping
because
Beauty is.
that's what happened.
Oh.
It happened in the mid-50s in Arms Textile, and people died. They didn't close them right away, and it resurfaced in the 60s. And in the 60s, that's when they closed.
Everyone that worked there had to get vaccinated.
Yes, yeah. Do you have a connection with Arms Textile?
I was in the Air National Guard in the medical squadron, and Rich DiBattino was the head of Manchester Public Health, and gave a talk on it, and records from his department.
Yeah.
And it was goat fur from Pakistan, and whatever the process was, it was making the spores airborne.
Yeah.
So they had like 7 people that came down with respiratory anthrax, and some of them died.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they cleaned up the plant, and everyone had to get, anyone that was going to work there had to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
And then, whatever, in the 60s, somebody from a machine shop next to the plant died.
Exactly.
And then they shut everything.
And that's something they wondered about. You know, what was that? Because it was a different building.
But something happened to the plant that caused it to come here.
Yeah.
Because they could never 100% certify the place is clean.
Right. And then
They just burned it down.
yeah, they demolished in 1977.
Yeah, then they burned it, didn't they? Didn't they burn the site, you know, and try to...
Not that I know of. All I know is they buried the bricks underneath the baseball field. So when you go see the Fisher Cats, underground, that's where the bricks are buried.
Yeah, I remember they tried, DiBattino said they burnt the combustible, the demolition debris to try to get rid of and tricks and the anthrax.
Yeah.
You never really sure.
All I know is the guys with the suits, when they're decontaminated the place before they tore it down, but I've never heard that they actually burned anything.
That's what I remember.
Yeah. Yes.
I know the shoe factories often had sporting teams. Did Amoskeag?
Amoskeag had a textile club, which had a baseball team. In fact, they built what is now called Gill Stadium. It was called Textile Field originally. In fact, the Red Sox farming team came and played in Manchester. That's just 1913 that opened. If you look at Gill Stadium, the stand, it looks like, the windows are all shaped just like mills, mill windows. So, and when I was a kid, it was called Athletic Field, and then they renamed it Gill Stadium. So, yeah.
My grandmother always talked about going back with her to her people and to get, sort of the genuine French Canadian food to Western Manchester. You mentioned the Flatiron area. Is that synonymous with what my grandmother, a lot of people call Pinardville?
No, Pinardville is in the west. You have to cross another bridge. You have to cross another bridge to get to Pinardville. Pinardville was started by a guy named Edmond Pinard, who was a grocer in Manchester. If you remember Ferretti's, those of you who know Manchester, Ferretti's, that was right near Bridge and Elm Street, that was, before it was Ferretti's, it was Pinard's store, but he was also a real estate developer. And in 1906, he started selling land out there, developing. It was part of the land was in Manchester, and most of it was within Goffstown. So Pinardville doesn't really exist as it's like a neighborhood. It's not a place, and yet it's on the map. I know. I never understood that. It's like Suncook. It's Pembroke and Allenstown, but Suncook has a post office with a zip code. Pinardville doesn't. So are you from Pinardville? May we? And if you want to see Edmond Pinard, just go to the King bowling lanes, and there's a mural there, and there's a picture of Edmond Pinard there. So, and they built a parish there, and he gave 12 lots of land to the parish, and they named it Saint Edmond. His name was Pinard, and it's on the corner of Edmond and Pinard Streets. So.
My grandparents lived on the west side in a triple-decker,
Yeah.
but they would never leave. And they thought my parents building a home in Pinardville was a forever away.
Oh yeah, that was like in Europe. Yeah.
Is it still majority French speaking or a lot of French speaking?
Not French speaking. No, majority. I would say the people. They're the largest ethnic group. I can tell you that. But as far as French speaking, other than my son, who's 37, and my grandchildren, who were 7 and 8, I don't know that there are too many people of those generations still speaking French. And I was like the last generation. I'm 68, and I'm the last generation to have gone to parochial school all the way through 8th grade. Because the year after I graduated, I went to St. George Grammar School. There are 8 French parishes in Manchester, by the way, 4 on the east side, 4 on the west side. And I was the last generation to go where you had to be able to speak French and speak English fluently, both languages, starting in 1st grade, and where you learned to read and write the 2 languages that you were supposed to possess.
The year after I graduated, so I graduated in 65, in the fall of 65, my sister was still there. They started teaching French as a second language for an hour a day, because there were so many kids who were coming from families, they just couldn't handle the language. And I can remember kids that were in my class, like even in first grade, who would end up going down the street to St. Joseph, where my friend Dave Callahan over here, you know, and his mother is a Lépine, and she pronounces it Lapine. And he doesn't speak French. So. But yet we had kids in my class named Sullivan and Shea and also some Portuguese, Soares and Silva, but their mother was French, you know, and so they spoke French. In his case, his mother, well, he had an Irish father who said no. And that's a whole other talk. The French and the Irish, that's a whole other talk. So.
I think Robert lovingly called the bandstand the
gazebo.
So I'd love to announce, we received these in today. It is our Exeter bandstand. They're $20 a piece. There are only 100. And this is the very first time that we're doing these ornaments. So if anyone would love to take one, or purchase it, I should say. So please, I just want to let you know what they are. First come, first served. Thank you. And John Ray.
So I stand corrected, it's a bandstand. So I learned something tonight. Thank you.
Please fill out your questionnaires.
Yep, drop them off with Jackie.
Yeah, and we'd like some help putting chairs out back if you have a minute.
Thank you.